My mother has a picture of my grandfather standing on a beach. The sky is blue and he is smiling. He has freckles, graying hair, and laughter lines spreading around his eyes and mouth. My mother has the sweater he is wearing in that picture. She has freckles and graying hair, and lines are beginning to form around her eyes. My grandfather died before I was born. All of my memories of him are secondhand, and knowledge of his absence hangs over every conversation about him and makes it hard for me to tell where memory stops and fiction begins, if such a distinction could even be made. I know certain facts about his life. I know, for example, that he was a pilot. He flew planes at the time when flying planes was glamorous, and loved it enough to die in one. He was stubborn, good with his hands, and determined not to buy a thing that he could make, which one summer included the house where my grandmother and uncle still live. He, my grandmother, mother, aunt, and uncle lived in a tent while they built the house. They tell stories about the chaos of pouring the foundation, the difficulty of getting power from the main road a mile down to the plot. But I can tell that they are proud of the house and proud of my grandfather. Maybe there's something of my grandfather in the fact that my uncle became a carpenter, and in the fact that he still lives in the house he helped build as a child. My grandfather was also fiercely protective. My uncle tells the story of a camping trip when a bear grabbed my aunt, then 3 years old, by the foot. My grandfather came to her rescue. He punched the bear in the nose, and it was so startled that it let go of my aunt and gave him time to pick her up and get away. Another time, when my mother was in high school, she brought a boyfriend home. She and the boy were sitting in the living room. My grandfather, in order to keep an eye on them, went to the hardware store, bought paint, and began to repaint the walls of the room. My mother tells this story with fond outrage, my aunt with a sense of raucous hilarity. I tell it too, to make a point about parenting or to illustrate how crazy family can be. I never met my grandfather, but that doesn't mean that I don't know him. He exists in the memories of the people who lived with him and in the things he left behind. The photograph, the house, the stories.
There are hundreds of videos on YouTube with titles like Grandpa's Memories, a tribute to my grandfather and We Remember Grandpa. Most of them are not videos in the traditional sense of the word, but instead are audiovisual presentations, joining pictures of elderly white men with audio. Here's a quick tour of their musical offerings. They tend to be pretty mournful. However, sometimes they're vigorous, but with no less drama. Sometimes the video is indeed a video, footage of a funeral perhaps, and the audio is the sound of weeping. I went to my grandfather's birthday last weekend, and I'm glad there was no YouTube video. There's nothing like clinging desperately to the past to show just how over it really is. My grandfather, or my step-grandfather, is that too honest, was turning 80, and I hadn't seen him since I was in high school, probably at my graduation. We used to go see him and my mother's mother as a family. We'd go for a week or two, sometimes during a holiday, and go to the beach. We'd sit in the hot tub, a sea of warmth on cold nights, and gorge ourselves on my grandfather's fantastic cooking. I went to D.C. last weekend and arrived in Baltimore by plane about a half an hour before my brother did. He was flying in from Minnesota, and my dad, flown in from Indianapolis, had borrowed my grandmother's car to come out and pick us up at the airport. I went out to the street in loading zone A3. My brother was in zone C, so my dad picked me up first. He was happy to see me, and I him. We drove on down towards Zone C, and it took us, or maybe just me, an unbelievably long time to notice or register that that was my brother, even though he was in clear view. He didn't notice us until we were parked right next to him. I hadn't seen him since January, a 9-month stretch. Certainly the longest period I'd gone without seeing my brother. I'm glad he didn't make a YouTube video about me. We drove into the city to my aunt's house, the site of the birthday party, and my mother was outside to meet us. I'd known she would be because she texted me and asked me to let her know when we were close so she could come out. She had flown in from Milwaukee for the event. The event was mildly fun and filled with strangers, just like any family reunion. It seems like family reunions are all nostalgia and no experience, like they're hanging on to a ritual for a god who packed up and moved away a few weeks ago. I saw a few people I hadn't seen in a while, snuck off twice to take naps underneath a bed upstairs, and many hours later had a fascinating discussion about American society with my parents' aunt and cousin. Like any well-educated, white, upper-middle-class liberals, we touched intelligently on race. When I flew back to Providence the next day, the rest of my immediate family went to their respective cities as well. I came back here, where it seems more and more like I live, to a room that it seems more and more like I live in alone. It feels extravagant for my mother to have bought me plane tickets to go to D.C. for a day. It seems dramatic and final, like a piano's lamentation filtered through YouTube compression. It's so clearly trying to hold on to something, yet the conspicuous effort is what makes it so clearly doomed for failure. It won't be long before there's a memorial video for my grandfather, and before I know it, there'll be one for me.
I think there's an age before which visiting your grandparents is more for their good than yours. They'll be so happy to see you and see how you're growing. Perhaps some grandparents are more spry and can run around with little grandchildren like aunts and uncles and cousins can do. Neither Grandma nor Grandpa were spry. Grandma had had a stroke, so she couldn't run around. Grandpa was still active. He could do work around the house, and Tom and I would help him. He was handy and had a lot of tools in the basement and was always working on something. But he had a bad back, and he couldn't run around with me and Tom. Their house was quiet, and maybe even boring. I was about 12 when he died, and I hadn't seen him much in the year or two before that. Now I go to college, where he was a professor. The other day I was in the chemistry department. He taught chemistry. And in talking to someone in the stockroom about myself and my family, I mentioned his name and that he used to work there. Turned out a lot of people around knew him. One professor showed me a room that he used to work in. There was an apparatus that he had built, the purpose of which the professor, who was my guide, didn't know. It was suspended from the ceiling and had all sorts of metal and rubber parts. Whatever it was very specialized, and there was no use for it now, so it sat there. He grew up in China, and he spoke Chinese fluently. I learned this mostly in going through his things with my mom after he died. He had old stamps and books and figurines and things from China. I have a little Chinese statue of his now in my room. I wear some of his clothes as well. It turns out that we're the same size. I never really talked to him, but I can find things he built, and I can wear things he wore. Visiting these things that were his, I visit him again, and this time it is for my good.